Okay, so grade 10, we are now going to be working through a video. I don't know for how long. I don't know how long this period of working from home and teaching from the office will continue. I hope it obviously finishes as quickly as possible. I was at the airport yesterday and there was almost nobody at the airport, and even I was watching the news this morning and they were saying that the shopping malls even in Great Britain are now quite empty, where people are scared to go even in public places. So it's certainly a worldwide issue, and so we have no choice but to deal with it. And I think quite correctly, the schools and BUV have decided to teach through the videos and through YouTube. I will be uploading this video up onto YouTube, and you will be able to go through it, and I will have some questions at the end for you to go over. And so almost every day, certainly for a couple of weeks anyways, every day you will have a new video. So what I want you to do is I want you to actually to save these videos on your computer, if you can do that. If you want to know a tricky way to do it, what you can do is just where it says in the URL, the address of the on your computer, where it says YouTube, just type in SS just before the Y of YouTube, and then click the enter key, and it will start recording the YouTube video that you have. And so what it means is that you will have on your hard drive, so that you don't even need to go to YouTube in the future. You can just go and watch these videos of Mr. Leo talking to you about the syllabus and preparing for your AS exams, etc., etc. So with all that in mind, we are now still working on Unit 4 of the syllabus. Okay, this is probably the most difficult unit. It is the largest unit, certainly if you look in terms of the number of pages in almost all the books. Macroeconomics is considered to be a major area of the syllabus, and you need to feel comfortable with macroeconomics if you're hoping to do well on your final AS exam. And you are at CVA, and therefore we should not even think about the possibility of just passing your exams. We are talking about doing well. We want you to succeed, and we want you to get an A or a B on your final exam, and therefore you need to sort of learn the tricks on how to improve your score from a simple pass to getting a really good mark. If I had to be honest, I would say that if you wanted to write the exam tomorrow, you probably would pass. Okay, even with the limited knowledge that you think that you know, you would probably get a D. Okay, and a D is a pass. Okay, it's not a happy pass, but it's a pass, and for that reason, you can go home and tell your mother that you didn't fail the economics class. But I'm sure if you have a little bit of ambition, that you're hoping to do well so that you can go either on to university or maybe to get a good job. And they are now looking for people with good results. There are many people who graduate with okay marks, who pass, and there are only a very few who do really well. And you should have the incentive and the ambition not to even consider the possibility of just a simple pass. You should start, even from today, start saying to yourself, I am going to prepare myself for a good mark. I'm not going to just prepare a letter to my mother as to why I didn't do very well on the final paper. So before wasting any further amount of time, let's get on to this Unit 4. Okay, I sent you in the Google Classroom, I sent you a sheet which is called How to Study for Chapter 4 Cambridge AS Level Economics Test. Okay, so we've got different topics from A to I that we're going to go over on this video, and we're going to sort of see if we can actually get through everything. And this video should be about maybe 30-40 minutes long, and then with the questions at the end, hopefully that will prepare you for video number 2 that I'll be sending to you tomorrow. Okay, so what I want you to do is I want you to have the book. Okay, you should have the book here, the economics course book, maybe the PDF file, maybe you've got that, I don't mind. You should probably try to print it off, borrow it from a friend and then go and photocopy it. I've spoken to some of the grade 12s and they tell me that it only costs about 150, 200 dong to have the whole text printed off in color. You don't even need to do that in color. You can do that in black and white and that's okay. Okay, so have the textbook or the PDF file open, okay, on Chapter 4, and have the sheet which looks a bit like that, and make sure that everything is ready for this class. So you should be preparing yourself for the next couple of weeks, maybe even, depending on how long this delay continues, to be studying through the video. Okay, so let's look at the first one. And the first one is vocabulary and graphs. As I said to you 1,000 times before, and I even told your parents when we had a parents-teachers meeting about a month ago, that the 2 key issues were graphs and vocabulary. Do you feel comfortable with the vocabulary and the graphic representations of Chapter 4? Okay, well, I don't know. I don't know if you do. So let's therefore go to Chapter 4, go to the beginning of Chapter 4, and see if we can see all the vocabulary that we're talking about here. Okay, so the first bit of the vocabulary we're going to be learning is the determinants of aggregate demand and aggregate supply and the shape of the curves. Okay, now this is something that should be pretty basic. Okay, we all know what the demand curve and the supply curve is in the micro course. So aggregate demand is really not related to individuals or firms as such. We're now talking about the whole economy. Now, macro is something that really individuals sometimes don't think about it too much, other than for political reasons when you're deciding to support one side or the other in a political debate. But most of the people who think about this are usually working for the government, maybe in the Ministry of Finance, and they have to consider, policies regarding, whether it's taxation, whether it is the amount of food that will be imported or products that are exported, and the value of your debt, and what should be the exchange rate of the currency, and that type of thing. So clearly what we're dealing with here is we're dealing with a subject that is in aggregate form, or in the total sum of everything in the economy. And so we're not talking about a hamburger like in micro where you say, okay, well, if the price of a hamburger at Burger King goes up by 50 dong, how fewer hamburgers will you buy? Okay, and that would be a very micro question. But now we're dealing with, okay, well, if we decide to import beef into Vietnam, how will that affect the price of beef, and how will that damage local beef farmers, for example? So obviously, if you import beef, then the shape of the supply curve will change. You're going to find that the supply curve is going to, let's draw this on the whiteboard behind me here, and we're going to have a, the normal, we're going to find that the supply curve and the demand curve, okay, and we're just going to basically see that there's going to be a shift in the aggregate supply, isn't there? So when there is this shift in aggregate supply, we're going to find that this shift is going to cause the price to go down, and this will obviously damage the producers of beef in the country. Actually, those axes letters are not correct for aggregate demand or whatever, but that's okay. Normally we would write real GDP. If you want to make it perfect, let's make it perfect. And real GDP, and then price level, we could say price. I'm getting a bit lazy here, so let's do it properly. And so basically, for a macro question, you always have to draw it with the price level and the real GDP, not the P and the Q, which is more for the micro. But what you can see is that we are now importing beef into Vietnam. This is going to cause a shift in the aggregate supply curve. This therefore will push the price down from P1 to P2, and clearly this is going to create a problem for local suppliers. So governments have to take into consideration the consequences of their decisions of, let's say, importing beef into the country. I mean, a good example would be last year there was a whole question about whether the government should import more rice into the country, and to what extent would this actually affect rice farmers. And of course the rice farmers were really, really upset. They work really, really hard. They're trying to make a profit, and suddenly the price of rice would go down if the government decided to import rice from a country like India, which is one of the largest food exporters in the world. And for that reason, it created a discussion, a debate as to the merits and the demerits of importing goods in order to lower the price. Now, of course, consumers, who maybe they don't really care too much about the farmers, unless you're a farmer yourself, but a lot of consumers, they would love, imports of products in order to create more competition, to lower the price, etc., etc. But there are, local constituents, there are people in the country who would be negatively affected, and farmers, peasants in Vietnam are an important members of society, and the government needs to take that into consideration when they are deciding, should we import products in order to lower the price, so that the urban population, people who are basically consumers rather than producers, that they can actually, who are going to be the main beneficiaries of such a policy. Okay, and so we can see that the shape of the aggregate demand curve looks a little bit like a normal demand curve, and the shape of the supply curve looks a little bit like the normal supply curve, but it acts a little bit differently. Okay, and then we can go on to other vocabulary words related to things like inflation or deflation, which actually we have on the sheet itself. So maybe the best way to deal with this is to follow the paper rather than follow the textbook, okay? So the first thing you need to do, and this is going to be really is your questions for today that I want you to do at home for day number 1. This is day number 1, is I want you to look on page 80, and look at the learning objectives where they have all the new vocabulary, and I want you to define them, each one of them, okay? So every one of those vocabulary words, there's about 15 of them. I want you, for your homework for today, I want you to write out the word, okay? So for example, the first line is aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So tell me, what is the definition of aggregate demand and aggregate supply? Okay, the next one is things that of inflation, deflation, and disinflation. Well, you can give me a definition of those 3 as well. Okay, so just go down the list, and that's going to be your homework by the end of this class today. Okay, so let's look at the paper here, how to study for chapter 4. The first one is to deal with vocabulary and graphs. You need to practice your graphs, okay, because you don't have enough time to waste. I think I've said to you that on the AS and the A-level papers, it's a common complaint that students feel that the exam was fairly easy, but it was very long. And therefore, a lot of students feel that it's unfair that they don't have enough time to finish the paper. And clearly, you could fail the paper if you suddenly decide that you cannot finish the final 2 essays, for example, that you had to answer. It would totally change your exam from a successful paper to a failure paper, and you don't want that. So it means that you got to think quickly, and it means that you need to have the basic graphs. Maybe in your exercise, you need to start, collecting graphs in your exercise book, super neat, super precise, super well labeled, so that you get bonus marks every time you use them, okay, in a relevant manner. Okay, the question here, macroeconomy, what is it? Okay, so right away, that's probably going to be question number 1 on your macro test, is what is macroeconomics? Okay, so that's an obvious question, so you need to be able to answer that question. And macro is the Greek word for big, and it basically refers to the economy in total, the aggregate economy, okay? That means everybody, you're not studying individual behavior like you do in micro, you're talking about the policies of government in regard to the whole economy, okay? AD and AS, okay, we talked about that already. The short run, the long run, the shape of the aggregate demand curve, what does it mean to be in equilibrium, shifts in the aggregate demand and aggregate supply, the Keynesian view versus the monetarist view. That's pretty important, okay? So how does Keynesians see macroeconomics differently than monetarists? Inflation, okay? I sent you last week a whole document on inflation, okay? And you should have read that over by now. And so there's lots of vocabulary in there. There's things like creeping inflation and hyperinflation, and terms like the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, and the RPI, which is, I think that's the Retail Price Index, okay? So in some ways, the Retail Price Index refers to industry and how, let's say, inputs are going up in price and that sort of thing. And the RPI tends to be incredibly useful for economists and people whose job it is to predict what will be the inflation rate next year. So maybe they can plan for the future. And so for that reason, the CPI, if you remember, it was used as a strategy to calculate what is the rate of inflation in the economy, and this is useful for certainly for people who are on a fixed income, or let's say trade unions who are planning on fighting to make sure that their members do not become poor over time. And so for that reason, it's important for some people really to know what the inflation rate is. Most businesses even will need to know what is the rate of inflation so that they can plan for, let's say, what salaries they can afford, what prices they should charge for their products, how can they make a maximum profit. That's what their objective is, the maximization of profits. And if you are doing your homework properly as a manager, you need to know what is the inflation rate in your country. Who else would want to know? Well, certainly if you're trying to save money and you're receiving, let's say, 4% interest, which is what the HSBC is giving me, which is quite a low rate of interest in my opinion, 4%, but the inflation rate, let's say, is 10%. Whoa, well, there's clearly no interest in me keeping my money in the bank. So what would probably be the case is that the moment I get paid, boom, I take all the money out of my account and I try to spend the money as quickly as possible, because the rate of inflation is going up, greater than the interest rate. So if the inflation rate is higher than the interest rate, then you are not making any money by keeping your money in the bank. So banks will definitely be affected. They will definitely have a reduction in their deposits because of the high rate of inflation. It's one of the reasons why monetarists are always so hyper about inflation. They're always saying there's too many people chasing too few goods, which is true. But it means that also that banks will not make any money. In fact, they're even going to lose money often. And they're not in the business of losing money. Everybody's trying to make money. And if there's hyperinflation, which really means like a very high level of inflation, it puts the whole economy into a crisis. Some people historically have blamed hyperinflation for the rise of Nazism and Adolf Hitler in Germany during World War II. And we can see very clearly that this is an issue when you're thinking about trying to invest. If you're a business person, but the inflation rate is out of control, like in Zimbabwe. I lived for 5 years in Zimbabwe, and you had sometimes 1,000,000% inflation where the prices were doubling every day. So it would be very difficult as a business person in Zimbabwe to invest and try to make a profit and try to run a business and try to pay your workers a salary if the inflation rate is going up so fast that workers don't really see the value in being paid in money. So clearly inflation is a really sensitive subject. Then there's the cause of inflation. So then we got the cost push inflation, which Keynesians love to use, okay? Things like, the price of oil going up. So when inputs goes up, it's not their fault. Foreign inputs, these are exogenous issues. They're not endogenous, they're exogenous. And therefore, these are outside forces that are actually pushing up the price. On the other hand, you have demand pull inflation, which the monetarists are always accusing the Keynesians of, because the Keynesians are very loose in how they spend the money. They're often handing out money to very poor people, and according to the monetarists, this is causing inflation, where clearly when too many people are chasing too few goods, what are you going to see? You're going to see the price of products going up, okay? I mean, if you've got one person with a chicken in the market and everybody's hungry and standing around them, you're going to find that the price of that chicken is going to go up and up and up and up. So clearly, you don't want that to happen, and for that reason, you're going to try to do something to stop that level of inflation. Okay? Then we got not only the causes of inflation, but the consequences, the concerns, the costs of inflation. These are all issues that are quite important, certainly for foreign investment. If you have an inflation that is out of control, you're going to find that a lot of foreign investors will not be interested in investing in your country. They will feel that you are mismanaging your economy. They won't have trust in how you run the economy, and they will look elsewhere. There are many choices. There are many choices available for investors. The opportunity cost of investment is quite high, and therefore there's many choices. If they come across a country where unemployment and inflation is out of control, they will just look elsewhere. So the consequences of high inflation can have a huge effect on the economy. Okay, and then the balance of payments. Okay, we talked about this a little bit in class. Things related to debt. You have a handout on that as well. We're going to go over that. You know, you need to understand things like the current account, the capital account, and financial account. And why is it that the balance of payments, whether deficit or surplus, is actually kind of important? If it's a surplus, then most people would say that that's a really good thing. But often you'll find that people will be very jealous of you, and they will feel that your economy is somehow abusing international trade for your own benefit. And the best example of this is Donald Trump and their accusation, the American accusations to China, who China has had a balance of payment surplus for at least 10 years, and the Americans, or at least the American government, or at least Donald Trump by himself, is really very upset with the Chinese because he feels, or the American government feels, that China is creating sort of a problem in the economy, and they want to do something to stabilize it, because they want to almost punish China for doing really well by reducing their level of debt. The United States has a monster debt. It's unbelievable. Even in terms in comparison to their GDP, most people would accept that the level of debt in the United States is totally out of control. And this is something that has to be dealt with. In fact, I was just reading a financial newspaper the other day, and it told me something that I never knew, that the two greatest expenditures in the United States by the government is, number one, the military budget, and number two is paying the interest rates on the international debt to banks around the world and to their debtors. That's unbelievable that the second greatest expenditure in the United States is paying off the interests on the debt that the United States holds. Just imagine all that money being used to build roads or hospitals or schools or good things, but no, they have no choice but to spend it to pay the banks for lending the American government more and more money every month. So that's something I found an interesting piece of information there. Okay, the exchange rate. Okay, you're going to need to go into, this is an important section in the unit. What is meant by an exchange rate. Now, in your answer on the test or in essays, make sure that you just don't say the value of the currency. It's the value of the currency in relation to another currency. So you can't just say the exchange rate of Vietnam is good, or that it's number 6. That means nothing at all. You have to say, well, the exchange rate of Vietnam in relation to the American dollar is, let's say, 2.3, something like that, which that's what it is at the moment, I think. Okay? You have to say it in relation to some other currency, and you have to say that as well. Okay? You also have to talk about the alternatives in terms of exchange rates. Things like a floating exchange rate, which means that you're allowing the exchange rate to float with the winds of supply and demand, which is a really great idea in theory, because it gives you a hard currency, and it means that you know the true value of your money, but it's very unstable, okay? And if things go badly, suddenly the exchange rate crashes, and if suddenly you have momentary economic growth and suddenly your exchange rate is doing really well, it's really difficult to invest, to make money, to be prosperous, whether you're a producer or a consumer with an unstable exchange rate, okay? And for that reason, a lot of governments, including Canada and including Vietnam, but don't quote me on this because Vietnam does not admit to it, but they kind of play around with the exchange rate. I think I told you that when I lived here in Ho Chi Minh City for about 4 years ago, that the exchange rate was absolutely identical, okay, to what it is today. And it's, in my view, absolutely impossible that it could be so a coincidence that you could have the same exchange rate today as it is 4 years ago. And I give the example of the Canadian dollar, which was at par with the US dollars 4 years ago, which means that it's at the same 1-to-1, and now it's worth 67 cents if you look at the newspaper in compared to an American dollar. So the Canadian dollar has depreciated, and most currencies, you look around the world, it's going up and down and up and down and up and down. Where is Vietnam's currency? Exactly the same. Now, I don't think it's a bad idea. I actually agree with the Vietnamese government for doing this because this creates a lot of stability. This makes investment much easier. This gives a good reputation to the Vietnamese, to foreign investors who think that the economy is well managed, etc., etc. So I'm not criticizing. I'm actually saying it's kind of too good to be a coincidence. So for that reason, we call that a managed float, which means that you're allowing it to float, but within a certain parameter or a certain bracket, a percentage bracket, maybe 5%. And if it crashed more than 5%, you pull the plug, and before you know it, it stops the exchange rate. I mean, they won't allow money to be exchanged. And so, and then at the end of the financial quarter, the government will slowly buy back, their own currency to try to bring the currency back up to the level that it was before. Now, don't forget, Vietnam has a lot of foreign investment, and therefore, at the end of every month, these foreign investors, they go to the bank with suitcases full of dong, and they want this exchange to US dollars to pay the shareholders of their businesses overseas, like Burger King or KFC or whatever. And the Vietnamese government have already agreed to do so. So you will find that this will put a negative pressure on the currency every month. And every month afterwards, there's a little bit of an inching back to where it was before, where the Vietnamese government uses their foreign currency reserves to buy back Vietnamese dong to put the exchange rate back to where it was the month before. And some people might say that's cheating, but I would say that that's a wise strategy, and it's actually paid dividends for Vietnam, and this is why Vietnam is actually as prosperous as it is today. Okay, we also talked a little bit about the J curve, okay, the J curve and the Marshall-Lerner condition. Okay, the J curve is essentially a phenomena which is quite normal. I don't know why they make a big deal about it in economics because it's very logical. But the J, just think about the shape of the J. It basically goes down and then it goes back up. And so if you are trying to affect your exchange rate by playing around, let's say, with, how can we put it? If you're trying to improve your economy by playing around with your exchange rate, by hoping that by devaluing your exchange rate, you are going to stimulate your economy, then there is what we call a time lag. And therefore, if you say, okay, I want to help the economy, I'm going to devalue the currency, okay? I'm going to make, let's say, the dong at the moment to the US dollar is, let's say, 2.3. Let's say tomorrow the government decides we're going to make it 3, okay? So that means you're going to need 3 dong for the dollar rather than 2.3 as it is at the moment. So that is going to make the dong less valuable. Now you may think, oh, that's bad. But for many people, particularly people who are trying to export goods and services outside the country, that's really good because it will make your goods and services cheaper for foreigners. And I include in this exports such as tourism, because tourism is calculated as an export. So for that reason, many economists say, hey, I know what to do, let's devalue the currency. And so what happens is that they devalue the currency and nobody notices. Nobody realizes that you've done that. And there hasn't been really the effect that you're hoping for. And in fact, what usually will happen is that your imports, which you have to import, like oil or technology, suddenly goes up. It goes up in price. And your economy is actually damaged by the economy. So suddenly you realize that the economic growth, rather than going forward, is going backwards. So it starts to go down. And only after a bit of time, when the foreign consumers suddenly realize that Vietnamese products are now much cheaper than they were before, do they rush out and start buying Vietnamese products. And then suddenly, before you know it, the economy starts to grow in a much more positive manner because of this exchange rate depreciation or devaluation. Now, as I said to you before, you can't do this too many times because you can't keep devaluing the currency just to boost your economy every month, let's say, because eventually you're going to find that your currency has no value at all. So I would argue that you could probably get away with this maybe once every 3 years, okay? Once every 3 years, you could probably devalue your currency just to give your economy a little bit of a boost so that people consider Vietnamese products really good value for money and they rush out and buy Vietnamese products. And so, this will basically, because of the time lag, have the effect of a J. And this is why we call this the J curve. So try to explain that in your own words, okay? And hopefully you'll be able to answer the question on your test. And I promise you, you're going to definitely get a question on this on the test. The Marshall-Lerner condition is another one of these, which is kind of logical, which is trying to suggest that, the only time that playing around with the exchange rate will work is if the elasticity is greater than 1, which is obvious is going to be the case. You want people to be responsive to your actions, okay? So if you decide to devalue your currency and the outside world are inelastic, which means they don't even notice or they don't even care, then clearly you're not going to have the desired effect of where people rush in and buy your products. But if they do notice and they say, oh, Vietnamese products are cheaper, they will go and buy, and therefore, it means that they are elastic. So they make it into a big deal, and some guy called Mr. Marshall and Mr. Lerner decided, I don't know, they probably wrote a book on the subject, which is so incredibly obvious. I don't know why they need to write a book, but that's what they did. And you need to be able to understand the logic of the Marshall-Lerner condition so that when a question comes up, you can kind of slip that in. You can slip in the Marshall-Lerner condition into your answer in order to kind of boost your mark and get a couple of bonus marks so that you move from like a C to a B or an A or whatever on your test. Terms of trade, okay? Terms of trade are pretty important, okay? I mean, we think about it all the time, okay? We think about terms of trade all the time because, we consider the value of exports and the value of our imports. And the sad reality is that for most less developed countries, the terms of trade are what we call negative. We have negative terms of trade, which basically means that the value of your exports, in other words, the value of the exports of Vietnam, are going up in value less quickly than the value of our imports. Okay? So to give a practical example, you could argue that the value of rice does go up, but it goes up really, really slowly. So if you're exporting rice around the world, you're going to make money, but you're not going to make a lot of money. But unfortunately, the price of oil might be going up really, really quickly. And so if the price of oil goes up by 10%, and the price that you get for rice is only at 1%, then you definitely have a negative terms of trade. Okay? Now, what are you going to do about that? Well, what you're going to do is that you're going to try to increase the value of your exports or decrease the value of your imports. Okay, so the best examples that I can give is in Vietnam, the exports might be to, rather than selling ordinary coffee. I think I sent to you on Google Classroom a really interesting article about exporting coffee in Vietnam. And they said that they used to sell huge quantities of fairly low value coffee beans to the international markets so that they could blend the coffee and make it a bit cheaper for the consumers. And now Vietnam is trying to increase the quality of their coffee beans. They're also trying to process their coffee, which will add value. We call that value added. You're adding value to the coffee beans by selling, let's say, instant coffee, which is a costly process, which will make the coffee beans more valuable to export. And the other one was to decaffeinate the coffee for people who are worried for health reasons. They don't want to drink coffee because it has that chemical caffeine in it, which stops you from sleeping, and it gives you heart problems. Some people who have heart problems, then it makes your heart go really, really fast, and you don't want that. So for health reasons, a lot of people are choosing to buy decaffeinated coffee, which, to be honest, is a lot more expensive. But Vietnam has decided that they're going to take the high road, and they're going to start processing higher quality beans, decaffeinated coffee and instant coffee, rather than just selling their coffee beans on the international market at a very low value. That would be one way to help the terms of trade. I think I gave you also the example of Zimbabwe, where Zimbabwe's #1 export is tobacco. I lived there for 5 years, and I know that it's wall-to-wall tobacco in Zimbabwe. But they always got a very low value for a low price for their tobacco, because they just used to sell them as big bales, which is like a square cube, almost a big square cube of tobacco, and they would sell it to all the international producers that are making cigarettes. And then Zimbabwe said to themselves, we have a problem with our terms of trade. The value of our exports are really not high enough. I know what we're going to do. Let's try to make cigarettes here in Zimbabwe. And rather than just selling the cubes of tobacco in its raw form, let's try to process them into cigarettes and try to keep the profit in the country, in Zimbabwe. And they've done it. And to a certain extent, they have been successful. Of course, a lot of multinationals like Marlboro cigarettes, Imperial Tobacco, these characters, they don't like that, because they want to make the profit for themselves. They want to go to countries like Zimbabwe, buy the cheap tobacco, bring it to Great Britain, process it into cigarettes, and then sell the cigarettes back to Zimbabwe if necessary, because that's where all the money is made. Cocoa beans is another example where countries in West Africa, they grow lots of cocoa beans to make chocolate, but they sell all the cocoa beans on these big super tankers to Great Britain. Then Cadbury or other chocolate makers in Britain will process the cocoa beans into chocolate and then sell the chocolate back to those very countries and other countries around the world. Well, countries like Nigeria and Ghana have decided that they don't want that anymore. They want to make the majority of the profits, and therefore they want to make the chocolate in West Africa itself. So we're going to see if that's actually very successful. Now, to reduce the price of imports to help the terms of trade, clearly you're going to have to move away from things that you are buying all the time, like oil. So certainly when Vietnam starts using wind farms with windmills and using solar panels, this will reduce the amount of oil and natural gas that Vietnam has to import every year, and that would help the terms of trade. So anything that you can increase the value of your exports and decrease the value of your imports will always help your terms of trade. Okay, we're coming to the end. The international trade, this is the whole story is about David Ricardo. If you read the chapter, you can look up David Ricardo, Google him, and there's lots of information about him. Basically, you need to be able to explain absolute and comparative advantage. That's it. Okay? You'll probably be asked questions like, why is international trade good? And what is a comparative advantage compared to absolute advantage? They will probably ask you about specialization, because that's what David Ricardo talked about. He said that rather than trying to produce everything, you should specialize and do something really, really well, and then import what you cannot really produce yourself so well. So David Ricardo gave the example of wine and textiles between Great Britain and Portugal in the 19th century, and he talked a little bit about why it is that the soil in Britain is not that good and the climate is not that good for growing wine, and therefore even though Britain can grow wine, if you go to Britain on holiday you can see a lot of British wine, but it's not all that good. It's very sweet and nasty tasting, and definitely the Portuguese produce better wine. So for historical reasons, Britain has always been making textiles, maybe because of their sheep or their, I don't know, their cotton that they would buy from their colonies in the Caribbean or in India, that they had a long tradition of mills in northern England that would make textiles at a very efficient, cheap price, and for that reason it was concluded by David Ricardo that the Portuguese should basically grow to specialize in growing wine, because they do that really, really well, and then leave the textiles to the British because they're more efficient than the Portuguese, and then the British should do the same thing, and they should produce the textiles and import the wine because they don't produce very good wine. And that's something that probably 99% of the economists around the world would accept. They would believe that. And we call that absolute advantage. I can't think of anybody I've ever met who knows something about economics that would not agree with absolute advantage. I gave you the example about Japan and New Zealand, about sheep and motorcycles, I think it was, and that was another example where clearly the Japanese, where it's only about 2% normal land and the rest is very mountainous, cannot grow sheep or agricultural products, and therefore they should basically leave agricultural products to other countries, and they should specialize on doing what they do best, which is things like electronics and motorcycles, etc., etc. The trick, though, is the whole argument about comparative advantage, which came about because people criticized David Ricardo for suggesting that every country will benefit from international trade. And a lot of economists argued that that would not be true because countries that don't have an absolute advantage in producing anything would therefore be much better off if they were what we call an autarky, A-R-T-A-R-C-H-Y, I think it's spelt, which basically means that you're self-sufficient and that you don't trade. And he said, oh, no. They would still benefit if they just basically tried to use the calculations which I brought with you, I discussed in class about, what was it now, Zimbabwe and Canada and televisions and tobacco, okay? And I said to you that the tobacco was more efficiently produced in Canada, but only slightly better, and Canada produced televisions much more efficiently than Zimbabwe, and therefore what they needed to do was just exchange the products so that Canada would give up their tobacco industry, because although they were like 10 times more efficient in producing televisions, they were only maybe 2 times more efficient in producing tobacco. And I said to you that that's a really interesting theory, but it's just unworkable in a free society. Nobody will be willing to give up their tobacco production to Zimbabwe just to be nice or just to fulfill David Ricardo's theory. Mathematically, it works out, but in practice, it's never going to work out. Okay? So this is really the debate that you need to consider when you're studying the subject. Okay? So you need to think, why is international trade important? Think about specialization. Think about autarkies. Think about David Ricardo with absolute and comparative advantage, and you will do okay on the test. And then finally, we have the section about trade blocks. I mean, there's lots of trade blocks. In Canada, we have what they call the NAFTA. It's recently been changed by Donald Trump, but basically NAFTA was an agreement between Canada, United States, and Mexico where we had free trade. United States complained that a lot of their jobs went to Mexico because now it was cheaper to produce things, let's say car tires, rather than producing car tires in the United States, they went down to Mexico because labor was cheaper, and that happened with Canada as well. And so the United States has asked for changes in NAFTA, and in fact, he made so many ultimatums and he got so upset that both Canada and Mexico decided to agree to a new type of free trade zone to make sure that Donald Trump did not cry in public, maybe, I don't know. We also have other trade zones or blocks like the EU, which Britain has just left. We have the ASEAN countries, you pronounce it ASEAN, not Asian, ASEAN countries, which are countries like Vietnam and Malaysia and Indonesia and Singapore, and there's a bit of a free trade sort of blocks, and some of the problems and that this could lead to, I remember asking you, do you think that it would be a good idea if the ASEAN countries decided to have free labor movement around the ASEAN countries? And you told me no. And should we have one currency where we have an ASEAN currency? So we no longer have the Vietnamese dong, but we have an ASEAN money. And actually you told me that you thought that was a bad idea. So you need to think about that a little bit, like why is it bad, why is it good? These are the questions that could come up on the test. Okay, so I think that's about it for today. Okay, we've gone about half an hour, a little bit over half an hour. What I would want you to do is I want you to look on the first page of chapter 4, okay, where it says the points that you need. It's like a summary review, and go through the vocabulary. And in your exercise book, I want you to have each one of those words, and I want you to have written the vocabulary definition of that word. Okay? Now tomorrow we're going to send you a new video, and it's going to be on another subject related to Chapter 4. This was a fast review so that you would know what to study for the test, but in my opinion, I think that the tests won't come for at least maybe, I don't know, five more classes, so it's still a little bit more time to finish Chapter 4. So we still need to go through all the material and make sure that you have no confusion. If you have a problem with any of the subject, any of the topics, anything about what you are learning in these videos, send me an email, okay? leo.s@buv.edu.vn, and send me an email. Ask me a question. I'm always available for you, and I'm really happy that we can learn together even during these difficult times. Okay, so bye-bye until tomorrow. Bye-bye.